Hello, we're in Thaxted today to hear and play a unique organ, an instrument which, if we allow it, can transport us back some 200 years. So I invite you now to do just that, and imagine yourself dressed in your Sunday best. You have attended divine service, and now you sit amongst the large congregation, listening to the organist, Miss Theophania Cecil, as she plays the concluding voluntary on the organ. That was Theophania Cecil's own composition. Her voluntary in D played on the full organ. I wonder, what were your impressions of the sound? Probably that the full organ is rich in quality, but not so loud in volume as you may have expected. You must realise that we live in an incredibly noisy age. The sounds of trucks, cars, planes, radio, TV, barking dogs, and other media are with us almost every hour of every day. This would have been inconceivable 200 years ago. Now think of some of the very large organs which we can readily see and hear, for example, in our cathedrals. The sight of the organ at, say, Ripon Cathedral or Truro or Westminster Abbey with their vast array of huge pipes in a massive case, these couldn't have been envisaged 2 centuries ago. So the first thing we must do today is to scale down our hearing and our sight to that of a church congregation of 200 years ago, and listen, not for volume, but for variety of colour. Let me review the facts about this organ. It was built in London by Henry Cephas Lincoln in 1821 for St. John's Chapel, Bedford Row, an evangelical place of worship in the western part of the City of London. Now, this is how and why, in the mid-1850s, the chapel fell out of use, and this is from a contemporary account. I quote, "Many were assembled for divine service, but when the minister ascended the pulpit, he perceived, from signs not to be mistaken, that the whole of the immense and massive roof had shifted and sunk, and might at any instant crush him and the whole congregation." This is the best bit. A very short sermon naturally and most wisely followed this discovery. Fortunately, the organ was considered worth saving, or perhaps someone decided they could make some cash from it. Anyway, the organ was purchased by Thaxted Church in 1858. And here it was played regularly for over 100 years, by which time it was in need of some repair. Since the organ had never undergone alteration or enlargement, it's been possible to restore it to its original condition. And as such, it is a unique survival of a 3-manual organ from the early years of the 19th century. The worth of such an instrument is invaluable. It provides organ builders, organ players, and listeners with a mass of technical, historical, musical, and artistic information. This English church organ is a unique survival from the late Georgian period. Most of what remains is original. The case, pipework, soundboards, action and winding system are largely as Lincoln made them. And now that it's all been restored, it can be studied, played, and, above all, enjoyed for the superb musical instrument that it is. So let's think ourselves back to 1821. The style of the organs then being built in Britain had been developed during the 18th century and, except for small changes, remained much the same. And that is an instrument with 1, 2, or 3 manuals and no pedals. That is, until a rudimentary pedal board began to appear here and there. The appearance of the case and the sounds of this particular organ reflect a somewhat conservative view of organ building and tonal properties, which of course makes it all the more valuable for us today. As I've said, the British organ, which developed in the 18th century, became fairly standardised, with a predictable stop list, and this organ demonstrates that norm. It was only a short time after this that the desire arose to have greater contrast in the power of individual stops, with the purpose of enhancing the accompaniment of choirs. And as the playing of transcriptions of vocal and orchestral music became more popular, there grew a requirement for more solo stops on the organ. And so in the decades to come, the Victorian organ was born. But this organ belongs firmly to the age before that. So here, for instance, we have 2 open diapasons on the grate and a number of solo stops which had become fashionable. trumpet, the hautboy, cremona, bassoon. The provision of a pedal board and separate pedal pipes was still fairly innovative, even for the 1820s in this country. Although William Russell, for example, had written pedal parts more than 15 years earlier. Now I'll demonstrate the individual registers of the organ. Now I'll talk about the individual registers on this organ. There are 3 open diapasons here, 2 on the grate and 1 on the swell. The diapasons provide the foundational tone of the instrument. First of all, I'm going to play a little Morris Green on the front open diapason, which, as its name suggests, is in the front of the case, so it sings out very boldly. Now compare that with the second open diapason. This is by Boyce. And here are both those diapasons together with the pedals added. And this extract is by William Russell. The swell had a restricted compass. It was really only the upper few octaves of the compass. So it meant that either the bass in a piece of music had to be provided on one of the other manuals, or the compass of that particular section to be played on the swell had to be within the available compass of the manual itself. Here is the open diapason on the swell, which is much more restrained. It still has a solid quality though. by William Russell. The choir contains a rank of open pipes, which is much more restrained than the diapason. It's the Dulciana. And here's an extract by John Stanley. Returning to the great diapasons, here they are with the principal added, which will give naturally more brightness because of the higher octave. The stopped diapason is also added for extra fullness, and here is some music by Samuel Wesley. We have the 15th. Continuing with more of the same Samuel Wesley piece, to add yet more brilliance and richness, the cornet is added. And to crown it all, we now add the mixture and the pedals. The stopped diapason is the other fundamental tone that's heard on the organ. It's more fluty and less solid than the open diapason. Each of the three manuals, great, choir and swell, have a stopped diapason. Here is the one on the great. All these examples come from William Russell. Choir. And lastly, the swell. In order for the organ to be heard at its most authentic, it's necessary to hear it when it's being pumped by hand instead of having the wind delivered via the electric motor, as up till now. And so for the next extract, it's going to be by Jonas Blewett, his setting of Psalm 104. And it begins with a very short prelude, which doesn't even relate in metre, only in key, and bears no resemblance to the melody of the psalm tune itself, but that's how he composed it. And this is played on the choir, on the stop diapason and the principal. And now for the giving out, or the introduction as we would call it, except that it's a whole verse, not just a shortened part of the music before the congregation joins in. The melody in my right hand is played on the great, the stop diapason, the principal and the 15th, while my left hand remains on the choir to accompany, and alternating phrases of the music are given out on the swell, using the open diapason, the stopped diapason, the principal and the trumpet. The congregation, he calls for full organ. I'll leave out the trumpet, I think. Now we'll hear another excerpt by Gillian Russell, which he composed expressly for the choir, stopped diapason, principal and 15th. It's got a lovely brightness but a lightness at the same time. On the swell, here are the open diapason with the principal, and you can hear how the swell box is used not just for crescendo diminuendo effect, but also for accents. And lastly, we come to the reeds. The trumpet was the first reed stop to be added to British organs, and it's the brightest of the reed stops as well. In this voluntary by Stubley, I'm going to be using the great trumpet with echoes on the swirl trumpet, and the accompaniment is going to be provided by the choir, stopped diapason and flute. The hautboy, later to become the oboe, is on the swell, and it's a stop which is associated with lyrical melodies. In this extract by William Russell, he uses the hautboy in dialogue and in duet with the cremona, and it seemed to be a favourite combination of his. This was possible because on the organs that he played, those two stops were on different manuals. Here, they are both on the swell, so I will simply repeat the extract, and the second time it will be played on the cremona. But here is the hautboy first. The final reed on this organ is the bassoon, which is on the choir, and normally one would expect to hear it as one would in an orchestra playing in the tenor register. But in this extract by William Wallond, the melody is in the low treble register.